All right, everybody, get ready because today we're really going to get into it. We're talking all about autistic communication.
We got a ton of your requests to cover this one.
Mm.
And honestly, after digging into the research you sent,
Yeah,
especially on this whole double empathy problem thing,
right.
I got to say, I'm realizing just how much I still don't know.
Yeah,
So
yeah. It's a big one, isn't it?
it really is. I
Yeah.
mean, where do we even begin with this double empathy problem?
Well, I think a lot of times people assume that when there are communication difficulties between, neurotypical people and autistic people,
Yeah,
that it's really on the autistic individual to, I
kind of
guess,
adapt.
yeah, to adapt or to kind of figure out how to be understood. And I think what the double empathy problem really highlights is that misunderstandings happen on both sides.
It's a two-way street.
Exactly.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's less about saying, okay, here's how autistic people need to communicate differently,
Hmm.
and more about how both sides can kind of bridge that gap.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like, imagine you're trying to have a conversation with someone who speaks a completely different language. You're both putting in effort, but, you're going to run into some bumps in the road.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Some misunderstandings. And it might be frustrating
Oh,
for both people. And I think
yeah.
that's kind of the crux of it. It's not about saying one person is right or wrong or one person needs to change.
Right.
It's recognizing that everyone communicates differently and
Yeah.
that we need to meet each other halfway.
It's about understanding those differences, not judging it.
Exactly. And I think Dr. Damian Milton,
Yeah, and he came up with the research.
he's really a leading voice in this area, and his work has been so important in shifting that perspective.
Yeah, it seems like his work is kind of like required reading if you really want to wrap your head around this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because from what I'm gathering, it sounds like he's really pushing for that more balanced approach,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that communication is a shared responsibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a two-way street.
Yeah. And it's about having empathy on
And-
both sides, right?
Yes, exactly. Empathy is key.
Okay, so we're talking about empathy. We're talking about this double empathy problem.
But-
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Right.
Right. So we're talking about empathy. We're talking about this double empathy problem. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, one thing that often comes up is this idea of literal interpretation.
Literal interpretation. Okay, tell me more about that.
So for a lot of autistic people, language is processed very literally.
Mm-hmm.
So things like idioms, metaphors, sarcasm, humor, that can be really tricky.
Ah, okay. So like no beating around the bush.
Exactly, yeah. It's about taking things at face value. So you can imagine how that might lead to some misunderstandings, especially if the other person is expecting them to just,
To get the subtext.
to kind of read between the lines.
Right. To just kind of instinctively know.
Exactly. And it's not about like a lack of intelligence or anything like that. It's just a different way of processing language.
Just a different operating system.
It's exactly.
Totally. Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So for example, like if you told someone to break a leg before a performance,
Right.
someone who interprets language very literally might be like, wait, what?
Right. Why are you cursing my performance?
Exactly. Yeah. They're not trying to be difficult. They're just processing the words in a very literal sense.
Taking it at face value.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it's about like being mindful of the language we're using and
Mm.
how that might be received on the other
Absolutely.
side.
Yeah. And I think it also makes you realize that, someone's directness, which is another characteristic of autistic communication,
Oh, yeah. That was a big one in the research.
it's often seen as a positive, right? It can also be misinterpreted
Because
because
it can come off as
it can come off as like blunt.
blunt, yeah, or like they're not trying to be nice, but it's more that they're just
Yeah, they're just trying to be clear.
trying to be clear.
Exactly. Like they're not trying to sugarcoat things. They're not trying to be manipulative.
They're just saying what they mean.
Exactly. They're just saying what they mean.
Which honestly, I think a lot of us could use a little more of that.
Right?
Yeah, just say what you mean what you say, and that's it.
Exactly. And I think in a world where there's so much emphasis on subtext and,
Oh,
like you were saying, beating around the bush.
social cues, all that stuff.
Yeah, social cues, all of that.
Right. Reading between the lines, it's exhausting.
It can be exhausting, and I think it can be really refreshing to encounter someone who's just like, this is what I think, this is what I feel, take it or leave it.
Just being upfront.
Yeah.
I like it. So we've talked about literal interpretation. We've talked about directness. What about sensory sensitivities.
Ooh, that's a big one.
That's a big one
Okay.
because I'm realizing that that plays a huge role in communication as well, but I'm
Yeah.
still kind of wrapping my head around how.
Right. So imagine you're trying to have a conversation
Okay.
in a really crowded, noisy room. The lights are flickering. There's a weird smell, like maybe some strong cleaning products or something.
Oh my gosh, I'm getting overwhelmed just thinking about it.
Right. And for someone with sensory sensitivities, that experience is magnified like tenfold.
Wow.
So it's not that they don't want to have a conversation, it's that their nervous system is just completely overwhelmed by all of that input.
So they're not even processing what you're saying
Exactly.
because they're just trying to manage all the input.
They're in survival mode.
Wow. And we might misinterpret that as, oh, they're being rude or they're not listening or they don't care.
Yeah.
But really, they're just
Trying to cope.
trying to survive this sensory onslaught.
Exactly. And it's not just like external stuff either, right? Like we've all had that experience where like a tag on our shirt is bothering us or
You have a headache.
yes, or you have a headache and you can't focus.
Yes.
And it's the same thing. It's just that for someone with sensory sensitivities,
Right. It's heightened.
it's heightened, it's more frequent, and it can really impact their ability to engage in communication.
So it's about being mindful of the environment,
Mm-hmm.
being mindful of, how we're coming across
Absolutely.
and just being kind of, I don't know, compassionate.
Yeah, compassionate and understanding that everyone experiences the world differently.
Yeah, that's huge. What about this need for routine that I keep coming across? How does that play into this whole communication thing?
Oh, that's a good one.
Because I know that's a big one for a lot of autistic people.
It is, and it can be really important for communication because routines provide a sense of predictability and control, right?
Right.
So imagine you're someone who thrives on routine, and then suddenly everything's thrown off. Like maybe you're having a conversation in a different place than usual,
Oh.
or the topic of conversation changes abruptly.
Oh, that's a good point.
That can be really unsettling.
It's like pulling the rug out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because now all the rules have changed.
Right. And it can be hard to adjust and it can make it harder to communicate effectively because you're kind of in the state of like, wait, what just happened?
Right. It's like you're expecting a certain script and then suddenly.
The script is flipped.
Exactly. And it can be really disorienting.
That's a really good point. I never even thought of it like that. It's like having the script flipped on you.
Yeah. And it can take some time to kind of get your bearings again.
And readjust. That's a really good point.
Right.
So we've talked about a lot of really important stuff, about how autistic people communicate differently.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the big question is like, how do we actually put all this into practice?
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about it, right?
Right.
But it's another thing to actually change the way we interact with people in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. So where do we even start? Well, I think a big part of it is just education.
Right.
Like just becoming aware of these differences like we're doing right now is a huge first step.
So like reading up on it, listening to autistic voices.
Yes, exactly. Actually seeking out autistic voices because they're the experts on their own experiences, right?
Right, right. Not just like reading what some textbook says about artistic communication.
Exactly, because it's not just theoretical, it's real people's lives.
Absolutely. So it's about listening, it's about educating ourselves. What else?
I think another important thing is to create a space for open and honest communication. And what I mean by that is like, if you're interacting with someone who's autistic
Mm-hmm.
and you're not sure about something or their communication style is throwing you off a little bit,
Yeah.
it's okay to ask.
Oh, so it's like not dancing around it.
Yeah.
Just being upfront about it.
Yeah, just be like, hey, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. Could you maybe explain that a little differently? Or I'm not sure if I'm picking up what you're putting down,
Or just being honest about it.
Exactly. And I think most people, especially autistic people, really appreciate that honesty.
Right, because then there's no guessing game.
Right, exactly. It's about being on the same page. And on the flip side, if you're autistic and someone's not quite understanding you,
Yeah.
don't be afraid to advocate for yourself.
Right, like, hey, it's really helpful if you could maybe rephrase that, or I need a minute to process.
Exactly, because everyone communicates differently, and it's okay to need things explained in a way that makes sense to you.
Yeah, that's a good point. What about visual supports? I know those can be really helpful for some autistic people.
Oh, absolutely. Visuals can be a game changer. Like if you're trying to explain something that's a little complex,
Yep.
instead of just talking about it, maybe draw a diagram or show a picture.
Not a good idea.
Or like if you're giving instructions, write them down as well as saying them out loud.
Right, so it's like giving different avenues for the information to sink in.
Exactly, exactly. Because not everyone learns best by just listening.
That's a good reminder for, like, everything, not just communicating with autistic people.
Absolutely. We could all use a little more of that, right?
Right. So we've talked about education, we've talked about open communication, we've talked about visual supports.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in, but I think the biggest takeaway for me is just, like, patience.
Oh, yes. So much patience.
Because it's not going to happen overnight, right?
No, it's a process.
It's like learning a new language. You're going to make mistakes. You're
Absolutely.
going to have those moments where you're like, wait, what just happened?
Right. But the more you practice, the easier it gets.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
more you're willing to, like, mess up and learn from those mistakes.
Yes. Because it's all about learning and growing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, isn't that what communication is all about?
I think so.
Like building those connections, understanding each other a little bit better?
Absolutely. And I think when we embrace those differences instead of seeing them as obstacles,
Yeah.
that's when we can really start to connect on a deeper level.
I love that. So, listeners, as you go about your day today, I want you to think about this. How can understanding these different ways of communicating, not just with autistic people, but with everyone in your life, how can that help you build stronger, more meaningful relationships?
That's a great question.
Something to ponder, right? Until next time, keep those deep dives coming.